Good morning. My name is Judy Tonoli, and together with Kirsten Scott. My name is Judy Tonoli, together with Kirsten Scott and Darlene Broughton, and on behalf of the Mission and Justice team, which I see a lot of you here. Oh, even more? Okay, all right. On behalf of the Mission and Justice team, and yeah, I see you, we are presenting the second half of the video, Our Spirits Don't Speak English. We did the first part last week. It is on boarding schools, and it is edited from about, I think it was about 80 minutes. We have edited it down, so there's going to be a little bit choppy, but we're going to make it as smooth as we can. I think it was pretty good last week. It kind of highlights, it does highlight Indian voices about the experiences that they had with the schools or their parents. We're going to leave some time for response from you about the film, and we're using the handout that you all got to promote conversation. That's it. Without further, I shouldn't say that. I was going to not say that. We will go.
They sent us to Seneca Indian boarding school, and that's where we resided for 8 years until they almost closed it down.
I ended up in the boarding school because Mom and Dad separated, and Mama had 3 children, and she had no work, and there wasn't any way to take care of the kids. And I was probably the youngest one in kindergarten at Haskell. They used to take them that young. A long time ago now, that must have been in the late 20s, yeah, because I was born in 21.
I was raised with my grandparents until I was 5. And then when my grandmother passed away, I went to live with my mother, which I really didn't know. She would pass us around to our aunts and uncles, so back and forth. So when I came to Sequoia, I felt like, well, finally have a place to be stable.
Gives me chills to think about the small children that went to the boarding schools. Some of them were interested and eager to go to boarding schools to learn about them, but most of them were thrown into it, whether they liked it or not.
Our family was very dysfunctional. We had, my mother was an alcoholic, and so I had the choice of living home and living in that situation or going away. I chose to be in that school for that reason. As a 13-year-old making adult decisions, I felt like I had no choice. I had to be there in that school. And I did well after the first year.
I wondered why I was being sent to this terrible institution. Maybe because I was bad at home. I told my grandmother, I don't want to go over there. I want to stay home with you. I'll do anything you want me to do. I'll do it. And she said, no, I want you to go to school because some of these days I won't be here. Now you learn at school a life that I can't teach you.
Luther Standing Bear tells us in his work that he was one of the first students to go to Carlisle Institute, and that he remembers being outside a building and looking inside the window when his father was talking to these white people. And then his father came out and explained to him that he was going to have to go away to a school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And that Luther met that idea with a great deal of mixture of thought that included thinking that he was doing this because his father was asking him to do it and for the benefit of his people. He wasn't sure what it was that he was going to learn there or that he should do there, but even if it meant his death, that by going to the boarding school, he could be a warrior.
The students that came here and learnt skills that they could never have learned had they stayed at home. Their horizons were much broader because they left the reservation.
As I grew older, say when I got in the 40s and 50 years old, I look back in retrospect and I say, you know, I'm glad I went through that because it helped me, even though it was a harrowing experience.
People talk about how their grandpas and great-grandpas had got degrees and advanced degrees even because of the value of education that was instilled in them at school. They're still angry about the loss of language and the loss of culture and the fact that there might be an auntie buried in the Indian cemetery.
It was a bitter double-edged sword that left the families broken and the children, though clothed and fed, with the loss of their culture, facing isolation and psychological battering.
In retrospect, I look and I think it was a good thing for me. There were a lot of kids that went to boarding school that didn't do well. I know a person that I had gone to boarding school with. He had a lot of family issues. He was adopted and lived in Kotzebue. And we were very, very close friends. And shortly after he left boarding school, he jumped off the San Francisco Bridge.
Back every year, the estrangement became deeper and deeper.
And then when they did return, they had been trained at the boarding schools to do certain trades or to be domestics. They might have been trained to be harness makers or to be masons, whatever their field of study was. And then they got home and they couldn't use their skills to do the work that they had been trained to do. So this was a wasted skill in a way. And meanwhile, they hadn't learned to hunt, to gather, to farm. They had not learned the techniques of their people.
My dad was very upset with me because I'd come back home and said, boy, I learned something, you know, like George Washington throwing a coin across the river, or, you know, things that didn't mean nothing to him. And I could never figure out why he was so mad all the time. I mean, he'd be really upset. And when I finally asked Mom, she said, well, he's upset because you're not learning how to trap or hunt. You lost that.
The hope was that they would find work outside of their own home communities and not go back to the reservations. But that was not the case. Most students did go back to the reservations, and they would have gone back after this period of 3 to 5 years of constantly being told that anything native, anything traditional was bad and shouldn't be used. And so some of them actually forgot their native language, and after going through the process ended up back on the reservation with this very conflicted identity.
Being told all the time that everything about home was bad and that their languages were things that were best forgotten and that they should learn English, and that their traditional religions were just superstitions and that they should adopt Christianity.
They were brainwashing us.
For that white man, it's a terrible shame for him to be treating people like this. Because we are a people. We just need to be accepted.
Every single individual who came to the school had to deal with that onslaught on all their traditional beliefs and had to find a path for themselves and for their own lives, which they had to navigate for the rest of their lives. It was something that didn't go away.
One of the major things that was taught in boarding school was for us to be ashamed of our culture, for us to be ashamed of our language, to be ashamed of our parents. And with that ingrained in us as young children, over time, that became ingrained in many of our psyches.
Not only that, we lost ties with the family. And you'll find out that a good majority of ones from went to Mount Edgecombe never really learned how to take care of their kids, because we lost all of that, closeness with the family.
And they were not being taught by example by their own parents and grandparents how to act and how to be. And so there was that major disconnect that many boarding school students talk about when they come home, and then when they have their own families, about how to be a father, how to be a mother. And that I think we still see the impact of that today within some of our Native communities.
These schools lasted 9 months out of the year, so we were out of the family experience and settings, so parenting role models were interrupted. There was no reference to what a father is like or what a mother is like. These had ramifications later on in these children's lives when they became adults and had children of their own.
It left behind an inexperience with living in a community that was their own, and they came out of a community which was a boarding school, which was an institutional community.
The trauma of having gone through this experience was masked in later life with alcohol and drugs and abusive relationships of their own. So this was repeated for at least 3 or 4 generations.
Students who were sent away to boarding schools really did end up turning things on their head so far as what the U.S. government wanted them to do and what they ended up doing with the educations that they received.
Children are resilient. They found ways to, continue to honor who they were as Native children. They found other students who felt the same way they did. When they were out of hearing distance of the disciplinarians, they could talk amongst themselves. They probably did it in English, though, because they were talking across tribal affiliations now. But they were using English to begin to build, a recognition that, we are all unique, but we share something, too.
So we all went to Anadarko, Oklahoma, Riverside Indian School. And I finished up and I graduated from that school up there. And it was one of the greatest things that ever happened to us over there, because there were a lot of different tribes going to school up there. And the only means of communication was English, They didn't understand us in Navajo. And they hated for us to talk Navajo among ourselves. They'd get mad at us and say that we were talking about them. So the only alternative was to talk English in front of everybody, So that's where our communication skills came in, I think, that we learned how to communicate effectively in English at that time.
They all ended up doing on the surface what the U.S. government wanted them to do, which was, to learn English and, develop skills in a trade. But they also ended up using the skills that they learned in boarding school, like the ability to speak English and read English, to fight back against the U.S. government, to say, well, we can read this treaty now, this treaty's baloney, or we can read this treaty now, you never upheld it.
One example would be Samuel Townsend, a Pawnee, and he went back and he became a very important figure in the negotiations to protect the Pawnee lands, to negotiate a price. When the Pawnee was selling some of their lands to the whites, he was put forward and he was the person that did a lot of the negotiations.
And Indian students were able to use the things that they learned at the boarding schools to turn the power so that they could use the English language to preserve their own culture. They could use the techniques that they had learned at the boarding schools to teach others how to sing, how to dance, how to share information. They had taken what they had learned at the boarding schools and drawn it in and used it to their own advantage.
And they really used their educations to advocate for Natives' rights, to advocate for citizenship, to advocate for equal pay for equal work, and in many ways also to advocate for women's rights, because, in many ways, tribal women had more power than their contemporary American women. So the boarding school educations in many ways ended up kind of backfiring on the U.S.
ironically, and this is where Richard Henry Pratt would probably be spinning in his grave, that contrary to the notion that this school was going to take any sense of pride, a sense of pride away from them, it did just the opposite. It became their institution, the informal institution, the institution of the students, where they began to say, hey, you know what? We're survivors.
Not all the children were able to survive, but many children were able to survive and take what they had learned from the boarding school and turn that negative power that was meant to change them, but turn that power so that it worked in the benefit of the individual and the people.
For those of us who lived and survived it, the whole experience, we're able to communicate, we're leaders, we're survivors, we've made changes, we speak up, we're able to communicate, we're able to write letters, we're able to make changes in our systems, whether it be in the village or region or for the state.
Learning how to navigate and deal with non-Indians and non-Indian governments, how to deal with city governments or federal governments, state governments, the various federal system of the United States, that came out of boarding school education and practical experience.
If it weren't for the boarding school era, I don't know that we would have had the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, for example. This particular legislation was the result of many years of many different leaders from different cultures coming together and fighting for a common cause. And it's interesting to know that many of these Native leaders from the 40s, 50s, and 60s became the leaders that fought for that were in boarding school. Now we're fighting for land claims.
Then over the years, the Indian people coming out of the 1950s, especially after World War II, decided they were not going to allow the status quo, that many of them had put their lives on the line for the United States of America in World War I and World War II and in Korea, and so they decided to take control over the educational system. It did not happen overnight, but they decided that they were going to have self-determination in their educational institutions. And slowly in the 1960s and 70s, Indian people started taking control of the boarding schools, so that the boarding schools that exist today are American Indian institutions.
Long relegated to second-class citizenship, American Indians began to assert themselves anew. Today, there are 32 tribal colleges in the United States, controlled by Indian administrators and educators, blending the Indian way with education.
It's indescribable, actually. I mean, there's no words for it. Just the fact that you can live with so many other Native Americans from so many other different tribes. It's something not everyone gets to experience, but I'm very glad I'm here.
American Indians have a very hopeful future.
Today is a good day.
In the old ancient stories of American Indians, there are always tribal heroes, males and females, who fight monsters, who go off and have to face them down. Sometimes they defeat the monster, and sometimes they are consumed by it, but there's usually a re-life, there's new life that comes from that, a renaissance. And so the Indian children who went off to boarding schools represent that change of time. They had to be heroes, they had to face the monster, which was the system that was set up to try to rob them of their culture, their languages, their way of life.
I feel like because I went to boarding school, it shaped my life.
Kill the Indian, save the man. In the end, the policy proved to be both a success and a failure. It succeeded in educating the Indian to the white man's ways, in minimizing, for a time, the language and the culture. But it failed to eliminate Indian languages. It failed to destroy the culture. And it failed to assimilate Indians into red-skinned white people. Ironically, what it did do was provide the Indians with the tools they needed to be on a more equal footing, to learn the law, and to use the law for the betterment of their own people.
Well, someday somebody will hear me.
All right, we have some time for comments and reactions to what we saw. Some of you who were here last week may have comments from kind of carryover from last week as well, but curious as to what your reactions might be to today's portion. What new perspectives or observations did you gain from today?
Personally, I think it's continuing, but in a more subtle way.
I will give you this. Oh, there we go. We want to hear you.
Personally, I think it's happening today in a more subtle way, what's happening in states in telling women, for example, how their health situation is going to stay without their consent. Also, you hear what's going on in a lot of schools where they are afraid to teach children the truth. And that's coming from governments, not federal maybe, but state. So from that standpoint, there's still that encouragement to make people think the way, let's say, a majority might think, or some of the majority may think.
Right. Interesting. Thank you. What year was this film made? That's a good question. Give him the microphone.
They interviewed Jim Thorpe's daughter, for example, and she was born in 1921, so obviously it had to be early 2000s sometime that they did the interviews, right?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't recall.
It's somewhat dated, but yeah. 2015-ish, she says. No, it's
not
online. So it
have
talks.
any of you ever been told to hide your heritage in some way? I know after World War II, my family was from German background, and they weren't, they were told not to speak German, and that's why my generation was not taught German. So, I don't ever remember being afraid to say anything, but I didn't think about it as a kid either, that I was from a German background. Did any of you live in an area where not only the Japanese, but other Oriental-looking people were?
I used to work in Hastings, and Hastings had a bank called the German American Bank. And they had to change their name right around the First World War because there was such animosity towards Germans in Hastings.
It has been a problem for the United States from its very inception as to what to do with the Native Americans that were here. As a matter of fact, in our Declaration of Independence, they're referred to as savages and somewhat less than human. And that has pervaded our attitude towards Native Americans. And just to give you a couple small examples of my experience, when we were in Alaska, and there were lots of boxes of clothes sent to Alaska to the various missions, and we were told that when we came there that we should give these out to the people and in Nome. But we were told that the missionary in Shishmaref had decided what to give to each family. And so she divided stuff up according to the families. And we didn't know the families that well in Nome, and so what we decided was that we would have a sale, and for a penny, people could come and select what they wanted and what they needed, to respect people's wants, not to think that we knew better than what they did about what they needed. And the second, just little incident, Fred Aquilic, who lived right next door to us, Fred, when we were there, and this was, almost 70 years ago now, but Fred was in his 60s, and Fred said the first white man that he ever saw was from a whaling ship that came into what was then called Teller Mission, and the fellow traded a barrel of home brew for a pile of furs that they had. This is just a small example of how historically we have treated Native peoples a little less than human. So.
I was interested when they were talking about the effects, some of the good things that came out of these schools too, that the Indians became educated in the white man's way, and therefore they could speak English, they could read technical documents, and really stand up for their way of life, and not be tricked as they had been so many times before. So I thought, I've never heard that perspective, and so that was something interesting.
As an Alaskan, I actually just home, when I visited my parents in March, I had my hair cut, and my hair cutter was an Alaskan native who was a graduate of Mount Edgecombe, and that's where she met her boyfriend. And it was sort of neat to see where the repurposing and the ownership of the school in Mount Edgecombe now is pretty well respected in the Alaskan communities, where when the students are choosing to go and creating that, particularly a Pan-Alaskan identity.
I was going to ask what other ways that you see the Indian people taking or claiming their self-advocacy in today's political arena or goings-on, current events. I think we continue to see that, but you wanted to speak.
Yeah,
Yep.
just a more current example of when you said that
you had to kind of hide your German heritage. Our daughter is adopted from Guatemala, and when ICE during the Trump era was scooping up people right and left, it was interesting because, and they scooped up a restaurant owner who lived literally 5 minutes. His restaurant was literally 5 minutes from our house, and it was a case of mistaken identity, so he was returned after 2 weeks. But it was interesting because it was my daughter's friends who were absolutely terrified that Paula would be scooped up. And they made a pact amongst them that somebody would be around her at all times when she wasn't at home, so that they could say, let us know if she had gotten scooped up by ICE. But there was genuine fear when she was in high school that she would be scooped. I understand that very well. Our other daughter-in-law is also from Honduras and lives in Texas, and she didn't always carry her papers with her. And I know that if she had been stopped by somebody, you know, an ICE official or a police officer, she gets flustered easy, and then she loses her language skills, which happens to all of us, I think, in a second language. And I was afraid too, not only for her, but for my grandchildren, that they would be scooped up and the kids separated and would be lost track of. So.
I wanted to move to the, just take time for the land acknowledgement, the proposed land acknowledgement statement, where a subcommittee of the Mission and Justice group has done some wordsmithing and looking at a variety of statements and proposed something that has gone to our council and then come back to us. And so we're in the midst of working on it, and it will come to the congregation again. But this is the first time that we're giving you a look at it. And on the back is just part of that, is one version of that. There's yet another slight version of this in the works as well. So I think I will go ahead and read that. Bethel Lutheran Church stands on land that is the home of the Wapakude Band of the Dakota Nation, whose people have been stewarding this land for many generations. We offer sincere regrets for the injustices done to them, unkept promises, broken treaties, forced removal from homes, and genocide. So with God's help, we pledge to repair relationships with our Indigenous neighbors by learning about their history, current stories, and public policies that have impacted and continue to impact their lives. And then we have two options here. One, in doing so, we commit ourselves to standing with the Dakota Nation, whom we see as brothers and sisters under God, making inroads to interrupt systemic racism and helping promote healing and justice. In doing so, we commit ourselves to standing with them, making inroads to interrupt systemic racism and helping promote healing and justice. I think we are with, I don't know where we are. We're with number 2 right now.
And I know the council had proposed a couple of word changes. Bill, do you recall?
We'll get a mic. Hang on just a second. We'll get a microphone to you.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do it justice in terms of, the statements came to council where kind of as a group we tried to, we extremely strongly endorse the statement, but I think there was just some language, it was proposed that we change. It's more grammatical to make it more simplistic and strong. So instead of we offer sincere regrets, to change it to we regret the injustices, to make it more powerful,
Right.
as opposed to offering it, we're giving it. And then I'm trying to remember what the second one was. There
I
was
think at
very
the
similar.
At the top, it was the home of the Wapakute Band of the Dakota Nation, whose people have been stewarding. Did we change it to who are stewarding or who steward?
That could be.
Kind of a present tense, or?
Yeah, I apologize. I can look at my emails really quick too. But it was a similar grammatical change.
Right.
It doesn't
Right.
change the structure of the statement, but just more to make it more powerful and concise.
Right. Right. Thank you. So what, if you have any responses or thoughts at this time, we would welcome them.
I just want to make a little comment about the statement, and that is, once we've formalized a statement that we can all agree on, our purpose is not to put this in the cupboard. I hope that we see it in our bulletin and as a part of our publications, that we acknowledge this commitment that we have, not just by a short paragraph and statement, but that it becomes a part of our learning, just as we have taken the statement from Arla and use it for ongoing education in our church, and will encourage. And the same thing with our commitment to acknowledge that we have a great debt here, and that we need to learn about these people that we have stolen land from, and that we will educate our congregation, not just pretty much across generations, that we have an ability and a duty to do this. So that's my preach for the morning.
And I would add that it doesn't end with the statement. We proceed from there with action and continued learning, if that wasn't already said by Dottie. Okay.
On the back side of your paper, I think, did everybody get paper? If you didn't, there's a group of them right at the back to grab on the way out, but I think everybody got one. The back side has a website, and if you just put in elca.org, that's a huge website. So you could put the / and then Truth and Healing, and that will bring up the ELCA's videos. It's like videos and readings, and there's something called Indian 101 that's going to be brought back again in June, and it's going to be led by Vance Blackhawk, who is the ELCA Director for Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, and he gives like a little workshop, and you can put in comments about it, and so you would get to that from the ELCA website. Also, May is, they call it MMIW month. It stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, and May 5th, which is on a Friday, this next Friday, is Wear Red National Day of Awareness for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. There's an awful lot of other stuff too on the elca.org website, Truth in Healing. And it will be changing on and off depending on, what the LCA wants to focus on. I think it's a really good thing to keep in mind and to keep up with and see what's going on in that website.
If there isn't anything else, I think, Gary wants to say.
I appreciate what the land acknowledgement statement is, because I watched, sound like Kurt did too, watched the 101 thing, and in there, I've always wondered, you say, well, big deal, we're saying, yep, we took your land, but guess what, we're not going to give it back. And in there, the Native American speaker very much was open and wanted places to make this statement, and he mentioned churches, and exactly what Darlene was saying, don't put this thing away somewhere. Have it where people can see it. Have people can see it every Sunday. And then one other thing, point he made, and I thought it was a very good one, he said, in the U.S. we have a Bureau of Indian Affairs. We do not have a Bureau of Black People Affairs. We don't have a Bureau of any other group, but those poor people could not take care of themselves, so we had to take care of them. And not so sure we did a very good job. In fact, I'm very confident we didn't do a very good job.
When South Africa was turning from the apartheid system, there were a lot of court hearings, probably trials too, of a few people. But one of the things that came out of that, the black people, even though they were legally recognized as equal, weren't looking for revenge so much as just an acknowledgement of the wrong that was done to them. And they said just that acknowledgement took them a long way down the road to healing. And I think that's what's needed here and why a land use acknowledgement statement is so important.
Okay, thank you for coming and learning.